We're reading through the book of Judges this week, and instead of focusing on the individual judges and the fact that they come from almost all of the tribes of Israel, or the fact that they're not really judges in the way that we think about the term judge, they're more deliverers from the oppression that the children of Israel had fallen into time and time again. I want to talk about two statements that are made, one about two-thirds of the way into the book of Judges and one at the very end. And I'll talk about part of that phrase that's utilized in other places as well. So to begin with, in Judges chapter 17, down in verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. At the very end of Judges, the very last verse of the book, chapter 21 and verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. When you read through the story of Judges and all of the things that transpired through those decades, that statement rings true over and over and over again. But that particular phrase actually is found in other places as well. And it gives us an indication of just what's involved in that statement, they did this or did that in their own eyes. So for the rest of our time together in this particular segment, I'd like for us to talk about some usages of that phrase in the book of Proverbs. To begin with, in Proverbs chapter 3, the statement's made towards the beginning of the chapter. Proverbs 3 and verse number 7, verses 7 and 8. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Now the contrast is being wise in your own eyes or fearing the Lord, and which stands to reason. What is actually pictured here is an aspect of arrogance. Individuals that really assume that the way that they are approaching things in life shows the wisdom that they possess versus the foolishness of everybody else around them. Jesus spoke of the need to be humble. Humility is something that is dealt with over and over again, especially in the New Testament. Arrogance is something that is dissuaded at every turn, as well it should be. Whenever you come across somebody who believes that they have the answer for everything, there's a problem. There's somebody that's unteachable. There's somebody that probably cannot be reached with the gospel. Or if it's the case that this individual believes in the wisdom that they have, in their own eyes, they have all the answers, and they are a child of God, something is missing. Something is misunderstood. There's some aspect of the gospel that's been passed over or ignored or polluted, because for the child of God to be arrogant just does not fit. So you think of that particular statement and put it back to the situation in Judges. And that's true with every one of these cycles of prosperity and then forgetting God and becoming subjugated by other tribal nations. Then finally repenting. You see in aspects of all of that, every one of those circles carried with it an arrogance where they believe that they were the ones that were wise. I don't have to listen to God. I've got all the answers. Let's go from chapter 3 of Proverbs over to chapter 12. And in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15, the way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. And you can almost say, well, this really kind of sounds like exactly the same thing. There's a connection with that arrogance, but there's something else involved. This individual's taking it to the standard where he sees himself as the authority. It is not the case that he's become wise by studying certain things or reaching conclusions, even if they are presumptive conclusions. This individual views himself as the standard for what should be followed. He determines his path because he is the authority. Jesus made the statement in the last part of Matthew chapter 28 that all authority had been given to him in heaven and on earth, and not to us. And as a child of God, we understand that, or we should. The world, however, parades its own arrogance and the wisdom that it thinks it possesses, or the world sees itself as the authority rather than any kind of standard that is higher than itself. And that's a position that is totally wrong. In fact, verse 16 of the same chapter, a fool's wrath is known at once, but a prudent man covers shame. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that made the statement, it's better to be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Individuals that are wise in their own estimation or hear the way that they think of themselves, they're always correct. That authority that they claim never was theirs to begin with. Let's go from this chapter over just a few chapters to chapter 16 of Proverbs. And you find that phrase used again. Chapter 16 and verse 2. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. And again, there's an association with what has been spoken before, but this carries with it a self-justification. It's not just the fact that he thinks he has all the knowledge. It's not just the case that he believes he is the authority. He, in everything that he does, sees himself as being pure. No matter what happens, he justifies himself. Now, this kind of thought is something that you find expressed back in the book of Psalms. In Psalms chapter 36, beginning in verse 1, going down through verse number 4. An oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for he flatters himself in his own eyes when he finds out his iniquity and when he hates. The words of his mouth are wickedness and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and to do good. He devises wickedness on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not abhor evil. He flatters himself in his own eyes. And the way that it's described in those first few verses of that chapter in Psalms really kind of gives a little bit more of a definition or a description of what's made here in Proverbs 16. The ways of man are pure in his own eyes. He justifies himself, no matter what the case may be. He justifies himself as having a pure motive of heart, even though that may not be the case whatsoever. Let's take a look at a couple of more. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. Every way of a man. No possibility of making a mistake. No possibility of error. It's not just the case that he is justifying himself or herself for whatever they've done as far as motives, but the statement that he makes that every way of a man is right in his own eyes, he doesn't make mistakes. Have you ever run across somebody who, if something happens, it's always somebody else's fault? They are never to blame. Their motives are always pure. It's always someone else's problem. Whatever happens is because of what someone else did or did not do. They are never to blame. Their way is always right in their own eyes. They have all the wisdom. They are the authority. They justify what happens. Everything that takes place, right or wrong, is based upon somebody else, not upon. They're always innocent of anything that happens in life. We live in a culture that kind of feeds on that. Let's take a look at one more. Chapter 30 of Proverbs. Chapter 30 and beginning in verse 11. There's a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There's a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. There's a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, their eyelids are lifted up. There's a generation whose teeth are like swords, whose fangs are like knives, to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. The leech has 2 daughters, give and give. A generation that says, take, I'll take, and continue to take till there's nothing left. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. I really think what's suggested here really is this concept of mob rule. The majority of individuals, whatever the perception is or the conclusion that the majority reach, that's got to be true, even though there are often, more times than not, tremendous inconsistencies in that kind of mindset. It's almost, have you noticed that those who tout that you shouldn't be a conformist actually conform to the individuals that think just like they do? Individuals that talk about tolerance are tolerant as long as you agree with them, but if there's any discussion about a particular topic, if there's any disagreement on any level, you're the one that's intolerant for disagreeing with them. Rationality is something that seems to be flying out the window. I ran across an interesting article from the paper from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, that was printed actually on April the 9th. And the title of it was Safety of Parking Lot Church Services Questioned. And here in part is what it says. The executive director of the Oklahoma City County Health Department said his agency discourages these kind of gatherings. The department is giving the Oklahoma City Mayor's office guidance on the shelter-in-place recommendations. It goes on to say that most houses of worship have canceled in-person worship services and made the transition to online-only services through Facebook Live, the Zoom mobile application, and other technological resources. This director said that he prefers those online services so that people avoid exposure to the coronavirus. That makes sense. But listen to what else he says. He said, at church gatherings, even those made up of people in parked cars, there is a likelihood people will get out of their vehicles. They may go into the church to use the restroom, or they may gather to talk in clusters. He wondered if people are parking at least 6 feet apart, because if they rolled their windows down and they parked closer than that, their exposure level would increase. He also said this, so you start doing the very things that we want people not to do. There are so many people walking around who are asymptomatic and they don't know it, so they are spreading it around. That's the big scary piece, he said. Each one of us needs to know that we may be making others sick. We have to kind of think like we're sick and we're transmitting it, and we have to also think like other people could be like me. They're sick and they're transmitting it. How would you behave if you knew that was the case? However, a spokesman with the governor's office said that drive-through religious services are permissible as long as they follow the CDC's guidelines. But there's some big question marks involved in that. And maybe you saw the news or read somewhere else that in another state, not in Oklahoma, there was a church trying to run a drive-in service using a radio frequency that could only be heard within a block from their building. They had their Wednesday service shut down by local police. Here's a quote from one of the individuals that was there. The police started coming up, and we said, well, we think we're in our rights. They started issuing tickets, $500 tickets, maybe 20 or 30 tickets. Everybody got one. It wasn't per car. The person who's doing the talking was quoted as saying that he and his wife were both in the car, and both of them received a $500 ticket. Now, understand the need for safety. Because we really don't know all the details of this virus that's taken the world by storm. But I got some questions when you think about all the details of this article. If you drive by one of these essential stores, like a grocery store, how many empty parking places are there between cars? Are the restrooms in those stores closed to the public? And I know and I understand that there are marks of 6 feet in place, usually by tape on the sidewalk, where they are wanting people to stay that far apart as they go in the store. In the checkout line, there are marks on the floor for staying 6 feet apart. How well do they police that inside the store? Now, one of these individuals made a comment about the way that people may want to go in and use the bathroom or talk or whatever. Once you're inside that store, is there 6 feet of space between you in one side of the aisle and somebody else in the other half of the aisle? One of the comments of one of these individuals, well, these people that are in a church parking lot for a service, they may be there for 2 hours. How long can you stay in a store before they kick you out? If you don't get all of your groceries in 10 or 15 minutes, do they make you leave your cart and leave? Are there some inconsistencies in the way that people approach this? It's worth thinking whether or not, even in the midst of trying to do what is safe, some people are reaching conclusions about what is right in their own eyes. It almost seems like if you're in a parking lot with 2 empty spaces or 3 empty spaces between cars, and those cars are keeping their windows rolled up with the engine running and the air conditioner or the heater on. That sounds like a safer place to be than parking in the parking lot of a grocery store, does it not? Common sense. The book of Judges, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Sometimes that means basing conclusions on assumptions for which there really is no justification, or reaching conclusions that are inconsistent in certain ways. We don't need to be like those in the time of the Judges. We don't need to be like those individuals spoken of in these various places in Proverbs, where we are doing or saying or thinking about what is right in our own eyes without looking at all of the details and being consistent. Especially for us, let's be consistent with God's Word as we share it with others and as we talk to each other and encourage us to stay strong in the faith. Be safe. We'll talk again soon.